and said he was innocent, and yet the racist criminal justice system moved forward. Turns out Troy Davis was executed within hours of somebody else, a guy named Brewer, who had dragged a white racist, who had dragged a black man, James Byrd, whom he picked up on the street, and chained him behind a pickup truck, and then dragged him to his death as his flesh ripped apart from the road. He was executed in Texas within hours of the time that Troy Davis was executed. There was very little mention of that at the time. The focus was all on Troy Davis's execution. Well, if you do a little research, what you discover is that the press accounts of Troy Davis do not exactly match the reality of Troy Davis. First of all, the so-called 7 out of 9 witnesses who recanted. The press created such a drumbeat of possible innocence that the United States Supreme Court sent back, in an extraordinary move, sent back Troy Davis's case down to the district court judge, federal district court judge, for a detailed hearing on the evidence in which the defense was invited to present any and all evidence they wanted as to Troy Davis's possible innocence, including the 7 out of 9 witnesses, supposed eyewitnesses, who recanted. The other thing was that there was supposedly no physical evidence that connected Troy Davis to the killing. Well, it turns out that of the 7 out of 9 witnesses, eyewitnesses that supposedly recanted, many of them were witnesses who had a motive to lie. Others were witnesses who did not recant and say that he was innocent and didn't do it. What they said was, now that it's 20 years later, I can no longer testify from actual present memory that he did it. Furthermore, the key so-called recanting eyewitness was sitting outside the courtroom for 2 days of that hearing. And the defense chose not to call them so that they would not be subject to cross-examination. Now, and they were there. Now, in terms of the racism, you may not have read because the European press didn't want to report it. The jury that convicted and sentenced Troy Davis to die had 7 blacks and 5 whites on it. The 3 police officers who supposedly manufactured evidence against Troy Davis, this innocent man, 2 of the 3 key police officers were themselves African American. One of them was an ordained minister and was known as a Boy Scout. The final parole board who decided that he should go forward and die for his crime was composed of 2 blacks and 3 whites. The elected district attorney who replaced the white district attorney was himself an African American, took no public position, but in the 3rd parole board hearing, the final one, slipped in through the back door when there were no media cameras present and testified in front of the parole board that he was not opposed to the execution going forward. And finally, the 2 African American newspapers in Savannah, Georgia, because I found it very curious when I started getting involved in the Troy Davis situation, wondering how could we move forward and execute in full view someone who was probably factually innocent, where 7 out of 9 witnesses had recanted. And so I read the 172-page transcript of the evidentiary hearing. Parole board, and finally the Savannah newspapers. There were 2 African-American Savannah, Georgia newspapers. Do you know how many editorials they ran opposing Troy Davis's execution? None. Not one editorial against it, and I investigated as to why. They did not want to take a position. Troy Davis was a manufactured case in which racism was claimed and there is no evidence for it at all. Now, having said all that, I am convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Troy Davis killed Officer McPhail. I am not convinced to a moral certainty that he deserved to die for it, nor am I convinced with no residual doubts. This is a perfect example of what I was saying before. If the burden of persuasion had been what I would have it be, though I would have convicted him of the murder, I would not have sentenced him to die for it. But the idea that this is a black guy railroaded by a white racist criminal justice system is a media creation from start to finish. It is simply a lie. It did not happen that way. Now, as to the other question, I think we sort of covered it, which is, are people born evil? You said no. I don't know. They may well be, and if they're not born evil and then they're made evil by circumstances beyond their control, again, I sort of covered it. How can we punish them? We have to take a compatibilist point of view, ultimately. We have to recognize that people are made to be who they are, and yet at the same time they choose to do what they do. And I repeat once again, if you take determinism to its full and logical conclusion, then nobody is responsible for anything, and then nobody should be celebrated for doing anything either, because we're all determined to do exactly what we do. And the final point I would make to you is that punishment doesn't improve. Well, it can sometimes, but rarely, but that's not its goal. Treatment, the goal of treatment is to improve. Ultimately, the goal of punishment is to punish. It's desert, it's justice, not improvement, but justice.
Again, let's please collect 2 questions, and please try to keep the balance of time fair between the 2 of you. So you're first, and then there's, I think, a question way back there.
Okay, so I just started. So my question also goes to Professor Blecker, and it's very brief. I would be interested in how your vision of a just prison fits the Declaration of Universal Human Rights.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. We're aggregating questions. I'll master this button. Even a monkey could master this button.
I think it could concern both of you. I don't want to pose a to-Gonzo question, but first of all I will, and then I'll pose some sub-questions. I think the question is, why don't we torture, or why is torture not allowed? Is it the only right way to sentence people that we imprison them, or is there maybe another way of how can we get them to the right way, or maybe just bring them harm to make them feel bad for what they have done? Well, the other thing is, for me, it's personal. If I was told that I wouldn't get food that has any taste, or that if I would get told that I have to eat neutral food, I would maybe choose to be beaten 5 times a day or something like that, but get some food that has taste. So is it possible that it's maybe just the point that we should sentence somebody to just one kind of sentence or one kind of penalty to give him a natural or a neutral sentence?
Neutral.
Yeah.
I'm sure Andrew has responses to these 2 questions. They're actually very closely related. Why not torture? Well, of course, the Gefkin case raises the question, and then you distinguish among different uses of torture. There is the threat of torture in order to save the life of the innocent 11-year-old victim. There is the use or threat which the court decides is the same as the use of torture. That is, it becomes psychological torture to threaten physical torture, even if it's never carried out, in order to obtain evidence to convict. And then there is, of course, torture itself as the state-sanctioned reaction in the form of punishment. The latter is unquestionably a violation of human dignity. It is prohibited in the United States by the 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. It also, irrespective of that, in my view, absolutely violates human dignity. So torture as punishment is simply outlawed and does violate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In terms of the kinds of prison conditions I foresee, as appropriate and just. They do not violate, in my view, at least my interpretation and understanding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We don't have time to go into this because this event is coming to a close, but I would just say one thing. We spoke earlier today in a class of 150 young German law students about Gefgen, and some members of the class said that the police should never have threatened torture in order to even find out the whereabouts of the child and to save his life if possible, because it would be a violation of the human dignity of Gefgen to do that. That is the kidnapper, murderer to do that. And I said I thought I was about to make a statement that I hoped, I knew would be unpopular, but would have some support. And that was, I made the statement that Gefgen's human dignity, Gefgen's human worth was not as great as the innocent 11-year-old child that he kidnapped and tortured. And the class split. I don't know if you split here. My view is it is obviously that. It is not the Declaration of Human Rights and all of these questions of punishment presuppose that some people, through some despicable, heinous acts and choices, can actually diminish their human dignity.
And that's a perfect encapsulation of a view that's very widespread in the United States and is relatively uncontroversial, that basically you are entitled to as much human dignity as your acts that you are responsible for make you entitled to. And you can give up your human dignity by committing an extremely senseless and violent crime. This is where you see the sort of cultural DNA of Calvinism that plays a very prominent part in the United States, whereby European thinking is more sort of absolute and deontological and influenced by the Catholic Church, for instance, where the idea is that human dignity is given to individual creatures by God and is inalienable and must be at all times respected. And so this is a fundamental philosophical divide that I encounter very frequently between Americans and Europeans. And I'm still American enough to have a lot of sympathy for that particular point of view, but it's just because I grew up there, and that was the cultural DNA that I imbibed. I would say torture is always unacceptable. We used to torture people all the time. We used to torture them to get confessions. We used to torture them to punish them. We used to brand them, chop off their ears, put marks on them, and chop off their noses too. That was a common punishment. And European monarchs were actually among the very first to actually abolish torture, either for interrogation or punishment. Like Maria Theresia of Austria did so in the 1770s. And then the founding fathers of the United States actually put a ban on torture into the Constitution. And I think that was a good thing, and I think it has to stay that way. Whenever it comes to like the Daschner fall, what I would say about that is basically, is Daschner going to torture Gefgens or threaten him with harm? Sure he is. I want cops to do that. That's exactly what I want them to do in a situation like that. However, that doesn't mean that society has to approve it, reward it, or accept it. As a human being, that cop is going to do desperately what he thinks he needs to do. And here's the thing, he's going to be judged and he's going to be punished. He must be judged and punished because he threatened physical violence and torture, and that is always wrong. But if he had good reason and proper justification for it, if it's something everyone could naturally understand, then his punishment should be very light. But he needs to be punished nonetheless. And if he punishes somebody, if he tortures somebody because he doesn't like their color of skin and permanently mutilates them, then he deserves to go to prison for a long time. But it depends on the circumstances. But I think the principle that torture is never acceptable is something that's fundamental to the rule of law and needs to be upheld, even if, in retrospect, we will reduce the punishment when it appears very understandable. And one more thing about the Troy Davis case, all I'll
really
say is
briefly,
that
please.
I agree with just about everything Robert Blecker said. The portrayal of the Troy Davis case in Germany, as with so many reports about American criminal justice, was highly irresponsible. Anyway, there it is.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry, but we're running out of time here. So I'll give each of the participants time for a very brief closing statement of about really not more than 1 minute, please.
I can't tell you how much I've appreciated this opportunity over these last several days in the classes that I've taught and the discussions I've had. And I would close by making a statement that I wouldn't have thought possible that I would ever make. And that is, I grew up as a child knowing and believing from my parents, without even really understanding what I was knowing and believing, that there was this evil, vicious person in the world called Adolf Hitler, and that Adolf Hitler deserved to die. And for me, the question was, since who else? I believe that the German people were evil. I've come to Germany, and what I've seen is a people who felt a sense of guilt, asked the world to accept them and allow them to make a clean break with the past, proved to a world that they had a much better value system than what had been perpetrated upon much of the world. And I guess my closing statement would be, after my visit here, and that I hope the debate continues about punishment. I hope the retributive perspective is given its due. But I hope there is always a disagreement. And I hope there is always serious resistance, not only to the death penalty, but to the retributive instincts. And I cannot imagine a people who I would more want and more trust to make that argument and to continue to make the argument on behalf of human dignity and behalf of rehabilitation than you. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to have met you, to have learned from you, to have listened to you, and to have talked with you.
I'll try to keep this brief, although I know that's not been succeeding for me lately. Sorry about that. But anyway, thanks to the organizers for the invitation. It's been a fascinating debate, at least for me. I've learned a lot and gotten a lot of new impulse and insights out of this. And I hope you have maybe, found something interesting in what I've said. And I suppose to follow up, I would totally endorse what Professor Blecker just said. Because I go back to the United States and people say to me sometimes, with a kind of like, a sort of conspiratorial attitude, do the Germans, do they really regret it? Do they really understand? And this question comes up all the time in the United States. You'd be surprised, and also in Britain. And they think that since I live here and speak the language, I have special insight. And I do. And I always tell them, yes, the Germans have gotten it. They did learn from this horrifying incident in their history, and guess what? You're going to be surprised by what I say, but we've got things that we can learn from the Germans in terms of humanity and in terms of just treatment. There are certain aspects of how German society operate that are now, models for many other countries, I think including the United States. And I think the treatment of prisoners and the handling of rehabilitation is one of those things, and I hope that's come across. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both of you, and thanks all of you for coming. It's nice to see that we ended on a conciliatory note. If you'd like to learn more about the views of both Robert Blecker and Andrew Hammel, you can, for example, borrow Andrew's book, Ending the Death Penalty, or you can download Professor Blecker's new Kindle single, Let the Great Axe Fall. I also recommend to you Andrew's really hilarious blog on German culture and German law professors. It's called German Joys. If you just Google his name, you'll stumble upon it. I hope I was allowed to say that, but it's really worth reading. So thanks again to all of you. Oh, okay. Or I can refer you to Robert Blecker's website, which is easy to remember. It's robertblecker.com. No dot in between anything else, robertblecker.com. So have a great evening. Thanks for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed the debate.